So, welcome to this workshop. It's not what it was called in the reminders on Discord and in the email. It is Introduction to Mechanics as Information. So, the job of a designer isn't just to figure out how to make a player feel something, but also to figure out how what they're already doing makes the player feel. Because how they feel determines how they act. It can be really easy to overlook how little things in a game influence how players feel, but every little thing does. And the way it does that is because every little thing has some effect on the information that a player is constantly using consciously and subconsciously to gauge how they should feel. And this workshop's going to focus on the ways that information works. Today, we'll be talking about how information works to impact how players feel, how what players feel impacts how players act, and how mechanics offer players different types and amounts of information. Now, what do I mean by information? Information is a broad term, and when I say it, I'm speaking pretty broadly. It's not limited to just statistics or details about how to solve a puzzle or things like that, although those do fit into the category of information. But when I'm talking about information, I'm referring more to how much the player can know and how likely they are to know about anything relating to the game, which includes meta knowledge and stuff like that. So what the player can know about, how much they can know about it, and how likely they are to know about it. So take, for example, the difficulty of an upcoming encounter. Regardless of how the player may come to know that information or whether they have no idea about it at all, the stakes of any particular risk that they may have to take, or how well they as a player, not just a character, but as a player, how well they can perform certain actions. Say you're playing Dark Souls, how good are you as a player at Dark Souls? That's going to influence how you go about playing Dark Souls. Things like what their in-game surroundings are, all that kind of stuff. A player may have full access to that information, no access, or limited access to that information. But why would it matter? So information informs predictability, informs affect with an A, informs player behavior. So as a designer, you want a player to engage with your game in a particular way or set of ways. You want that so that you can guarantee that a player is going to have the kind of experience that you set out from the get-go to create for them. But there are things that we can and cannot do as designers. So I'm going to encourage you guys to sort of play this little game with me and identify which column these things go into. Can we as designers make a player behave a certain way? Megan, help.
It's kind of like, it's kind of tied, but like we can influence them but not make them.
Okay. So the answer is no. We cannot make a player behave a certain way.
Only if we're the mentalist.
Can we make a player feel something?
Yes.
No. We cannot make a player feel something.
Okay.
Can we make a player predict something? No. We cannot make a player predict something.
Okay, wait.
And what can we do? We can do exactly one thing. We can offer specific information. And the reason that that is powerful is because when you offer them specific information, you can lead them to predict certain things, which then leads them to feel more or less confident about different parts of the game depending on their successes, which in turn leads them to engage with the game accordingly. So you can influence how players predict something, how players feel about something, and how players behave. However, you cannot directly do those things. You have to facilitate those things. And the way to do that is by offering the player information. But how do mechanics relate to this information? Has anyone seen this image or experienced what this image is talking about?
Always.
Probably, yeah. So this is obviously one example, but let's talk about some more. Compasses, maps, and waypoints. This is the first of 4 examples I'm going to give in this workshop, and this is kind of where I'm going to do a lot of talking, and I hope that you guys don't mind listening to me talk for a little bit. So maps perform a pretty straightforward function. They allow a player to forget where things are without suffering consequences. As such, the impact of a game's map you can think about it as being a source of information that is afforded to the player, and you can think of it in terms of how that information impacts how a player holds the world in their mind. It's important to note then that the amount and selection of information provided to a player has a huge impact on the amount and source of the fear, curiosity, and excitement that they have about the world around them. To sort of illustrate that, let's think about how people engage with different types of maps in the real world. If you don't know how to get from where you are to your destination, how do you figure out how to get there? Google Maps. You pull up Google Maps, and its job is to make navigating from point A to point B really, really easy. All you have to do is just go in the direction it says and maybe have a general sense about how far you've traveled. Okay, now what if you didn't have Google Maps? Say you have a paper map. It doesn't tell you where you are or which direction you're facing. It doesn't tell you how far you've traveled. How do you gather the information then? Landmarks. You match things up on the map with things in the real world. So this makes you engage with things with your world a little bit differently than you would if you were just following with Google Maps. And what if you have nothing at all? Are you stuck, completely lost, hopeless, going to die, cold and alone? Yes. No. Just ask someone for directions. Seriously. Most of the time, people will say where to go if they know. But they might not be able to give you information that's as detailed as a map or as Google Maps. They are more likely to give you general directions with a few major landmarks that you have to then hold in your mind to help you get a better sense of whether you're headed in the right direction. Each of those different methods of finding your way from point A to B, each of them leads you to engage with your environment in a different way. Whether you're engaging just with the direction, whether you're engaging with landmarks, whether you're engaging with people. As a result, the feelings of uncertainty in each of your moves, whether should I turn here? Is this the big tree that X person was talking about? I think I should have taken a left back there. Yeah, those kinds of things, whether you feel them or not, varies. The ease or lack thereof of navigation and understanding where you are, the emphasis that you want to place on navigating and how easy or difficult you want that to be should inform the kind of map that you choose to include in your game. If you want traveling to a new area to be a mystery the first time, but easy afterward, there are plenty of ways to reveal parts of a map to players at various points. If you want to encourage exploration while still giving the player a sense of where their ultimate goal is, you can consider using waypoints. Do you want a player to know how they're oriented, meaning the direction they're traveling, but you don't really want them to have to check the map frequently? You can use a compass or a mini-map. Although if you are thinking about using a mini-map, you really have to be careful about how much you display, because you don't want the player just looking at the mini-map and thinking of that as their sole way of engaging with their environment. If you want the player to navigate primarily using landmarks, just using a compass with landmark icons, you can see this in games like Skyrim. You can pretty much always know whether you're facing north, south, east, west, and whether there are certain landmarks around you. You can use something like that. Or a map with no player you are here indicator. What information you should require a player to have to discover on their own versus what information they shouldn't have to think too hard about is completely dependent on the kind of game you're making and the role and potential consequences of exploration and lostness within it. And lostness is a big part of that because lostness comes with risk. Information is security to a player, but excess security can be boring and or incentivize engagement with the source of security rather than exploring what's less concrete. Is there anything anyone wants to say before I move on to the next example?
Will and Michaela brought up Hollow Knight and Red Dead Redemption 2 as excellent things to look at when thinking about maps.
Absolutely. I think Red Dead Redemption 2 does some questionable things to me with how much information it offers the player. The way that the world map, if you place a waypoint, the way that the map will just straight up give you your path to it, that's a lot of information to give a player. And in some cases, it may not necessarily be the best thing, but then there are reasons for doing it in any number of ways. Hollow Knight's magical. Hollow Knight's one of my very, very, very favorite games, and letting the player choose how much information that they need to navigate is just, it's awesome.
Oh, I do want to. Alberto has a question. Are you talking mainly about single player games, or would you apply this to multiplayer games as well?
I think you could absolutely apply it to multiplayer games. If you have a mini map that displays the location of friendlies and enemies, or just friendlies, or even just enemies, you're going to create a different relationship between the player, the map, and the world at large. What the player can tell by looking at their map changes how the player engages with the world. What you know changes how you behave.
And Jack asks, do you think it's a good to apply variable options?
Variable options meaning that people can turn on and off or choose what information they want to be available on the map?
Like for access, he says yes.
Absolutely. I think that's, if it's specifically for accessibility, you should always have that ability. I'm one of those people who thinks that Dark Souls having an easy mode is probably okay so long as the point that that's not how it's intended to be played is made very clear. I think that accessibility options they should always be accessible. So let's talk about cameras. This is going to be a bit shorter than the map one, promise. So point and click games, for instance, typically don't do very much to suture a player to a character. First person games tend to do that a lot more. They do that by binding the actions of a player to a character. But when you're playing a point and click game, you click one part of the camera is not really attached to the player or to the character in the same sense. When you play a first person game, obviously you are embodying the character on screen, or kind of not on screen, but you get the idea. A first person game sutures the player to the character. Point and click games don't really do that to the same extent. However, what they do is offer players a greater sense of a character's surroundings. They can offer players information that a first person perspective can't. whether something is hidden under a bridge, and as a first-person character, you wouldn't be able to see the thing under the bridge if you're on it, but if you're playing a point and click, you can absolutely see that. In the middle, you obviously have things like over-the-shoulder third person. Different perspectives provide different degrees of psychological attachment to characters and offer differing amounts of information to players. For instance, players very rarely have less information than the characters they're controlling, and the difference in information is important to determining how the player feels related to those characters. So here I'm talking a lot about affect. I'm talking about how the way a player is situated relative to the character. I'm talking about the way that that makes a player feel in relation to the character. The more closely the player is bound to the character, the more attachment they are likely to feel. And so the greatest differences in play, if, say, you're playing a real-time strategy game where the camera is giving you a god's eye view, the player is more likely to view characters as pawns than as people or as extensions of themselves. But the smallest differences, say you're playing a VR game, usually result in a strong sense that the player is the character. The amount and the nature of the information afforded by the camera's position and how similar that is to the information afforded to the player by a camera and how similar that is to the information that a character would have is highly proportional to the sense of relatedness that a player feels to the character. The more information that a player has, the more certain they can be about where they are leading a character. If the player can move a third-person camera to see around a corner in a way that they couldn't in a first-person game, they've been afforded information that will heavily influence how they feel and how they choose to go about moving the character around the corner. Does that make sense? That's sort of the end of the camera section. So let's have a discussion about it rather than me just talking.
All right. I'll hit you with the questions in the chat. Ethan asks, wouldn't you feel more attachment in a third person / second person view rather than first person view?
If you're talking, it depends on what you mean by attachment. So if you want to develop an emotional attachment, it's very likely that yes, a third person view is, or a close third person view is more likely to lead a player to feel a sense of emotional attachment than a first person view. However, if you're viewing attachment as a sense of closeness or embodiment, so if you want the player to feel that they are the character, then first person is almost always going to get you closer.
Yeah, I think this is kind of getting into maybe a different topic, but it's it seems like there's part of this question is like, what is the qualitative difference between like immersion and closeness or like attachment?
So anytime you ask a qualitative question for game design, it's going to come down to what kind of game you want to make. But what I'm talking about here is mostly given when you're using information, what facilitates certain kinds of relationships. And when you want a sense of closeness, that meaning someone being more similar to yourself or you feeling more similar to or related to a character, the closeness of the camera pretty literally brings you closer to the character.
If you're choosing between like an over-the-shoulder third person versus a first person, is that kind of like the trade-off type of deal of do you want the player to be gaining, experiencing like things with the character so they're surprised by every action that happens versus them looking over the shoulder and getting a sense of like dramatic irony if they can see what's going to happen next before the character knows it?
Sure, absolutely. I think that If you think about combat heavy games, especially, there are oftentimes in a combat heavy game, the camera, especially if you're playing an action adventure game, the way a camera behaves when you're traveling versus when you're in combat tends to be different. When you're just moving around, oftentimes cameras will pull in closer to, especially in modern games, will pull in closer to the character you're embodying, which brings you to feel like you have the same information that your character does. If you've played any of the Batman Arkham games or God of War games, or the new God of War game, sorry, then you've seen how the camera follows closely behind your protagonist. However, once you get into combat, the camera pulls out and gives you a sense of awareness of what is around your character, specifically in the Batman games. And that feeds into, or doesn't feed into, depending on whether the camera does or doesn't do it, it feeds into your power fantasy. So if you want the player to feel more powerful, then or if you want the player to feel that they, as a character, are more powerful than they would be in the real world, offering them more information than they would have in the real world by giving them a view of what is around the character they're embodying and have been sutured to, giving them that information lends itself to that power fantasy. And so if you're talking about looking around a corner, being sutured very, very closely to a character and not knowing any more than the character does sort of have this sense of going along for the ride. Or alternatively, if you are in third person and you can tell what's coming, then it feeds into being able to be something more than human with your character and being special. Death. The penalty for death is a big question in games. The way they handle death tends to inform how a player feels about the game world's dispositions toward them as a player and as a character. And it has serious implications for players' likelihood to explore and or take risks. I mentioned before Dark Souls. Dark Souls has a pretty low penalty for death in some senses, but pretty high in others. And the way it handles death changes how players feel about taking certain actions within the game. A lot of games handle death in a way that's highly dependent on saves. The idea being that the game doesn't go on if the character dies. Instead, the player has to pick back up at a time when they were safe and try again, redoing anything that had been done between that point and the time when they died. In that case, the stakes for any action they take are just lost time, a relatively low penalty for death. However, other games handle death in a way that is more separated from the saves. Oftentimes, the games will respawn the character at a point they were before or some other predetermined location, often with some loss of progress. And that might be manifested in whatever way a designer wants, in a loss of money, loss of items, loss of actual progress toward a goal, etc. See, Dark Souls, you lose your souls, you go back to a predetermined spot, and then you try to move forward. This creates a subtle but important difference in how death is presented to the player. In this case, death is presented as purely a loss of resources or progress and is not represented as an actual death. The character still exists as they were just before the death, but they've lost something. There's a difference between the feeling of losing something and the feeling of your progress as well as never having existed, even if the mechanical consequence is identical. Death is sometimes not a problem at all. Some games reset your position and that's the only loss there is. In a game where exploration and discovery are the player's primary goals, this low penalty for death is often used so as not to discourage exploration. For instance, the original Legend of Zelda had a very low penalty for death for the time. Being brought back to the beginning of a dungeon or your starting point on the map is a pretty low penalty for death in the early Nintendo era, when losing your lives would tend to mean a game over, start from zero. Limited extra lives they've sort of fallen out of style in recent years, although some games do still feature them. But they do have a unique effect on the consequences of death. Limited extra lives often play very much like the type mentioned above or before. I'm totally not reading something. What are you talking about? They often play very much like what I was talking about before, where death isn't a problem, where the penalty is relatively low. However, the player is still forced to play cautiously, or else they run the risk of losing a much larger amount of progress. But what value might that have? Well, the result is actually kind of interesting, I think. And I personally am in the camp that says, consider bringing extra lives or limited lives back, because it's neat and kind of underexplored in the modern game design era. It shifts the threat from death to overall performance, but it keeps that really intense threat, or that looming threat. It's sort of like an extension of getting hit to lose health. You get hit, but you don't die immediately. You've lost some health and maybe something small, no big deal. However, if you get hit too many times, you die. And with each hit, you get more and more tense because death is more and more imminent. The threat is more and more present. That last hit is precious and tension is high. Some games will quietly make that last hit last a lot longer or to have a lot more actual hit points than earlier health, to make that tension last a little bit longer. Similarly, when you have limited lives, the first life that you lose probably isn't going to feel that bad. However, that last life, where if you lose it, it means a significant loss of progress, is spent entirely in the state of heightened tension that you have if you're left on that last bit of life. And the boldness of a player is likely to change not only with the number of hits they have before they die, but also the number of lives they have. And so death's role in games is to create a sense of consequence. And the extent of that consequence depends pretty wholly on what and how much is lost with death. The weight or lack thereof of that consequence strongly influences how risky and adventurous a player's actions are likely to be. And obviously, this influence is going to be affected by the actual frequency with which a player actually encounters deadly situations, as well as the rewards offered to those who act in adventurous ways. So if your rewards for risky behavior are really, really high, then a player is going to be more likely to take those risks, even if your penalty for death is high, than if the penalty was was still high, but the risks or the rewards were low. It seems obvious, but it's worth saying. Do we have any questions about death and consequence?
Chat has a ton of stuff about death. We really like death in this club.
Maybe not really a question, but I was just like maybe like an alternative example where you're kind of describing death in a roguelike versus death in other games.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. Roguelikes are a great place to look at a more unique way of handling death.
And then running on that thought, started thinking, I was like, wait, Minecraft hardcore mode is just basically if Minecraft was a roguelike.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I just, as you were talking, I think I just wanted to throw some of my favorite examples out there. I think of classic game of more recent games that are of more classic style, which would be Mega Man 11 and Shovel Knight. Both kind of have similar feels, but deal with death completely differently. Where Shovel Knight's very respawn driven, but there's always the risk of dropping your money, which you can always go back for, and the risk of dying a second time is the actual threat. So if your money isn't out on the field after you've died once, you're incentivized to always try things and risk death. But then once you die, then you're kind of worried about losing stuff. Whereas Mega Man 11 is all about you have this many lives for this stage, and if you lose them all, you restart that stage. So it's more about perfecting how to get through that one stage and saving your health and your lives to get to the final fight, keeping the tension always high throughout the level, yet never actually making you redo something that you already know how to do well.
And talking about the form of death where you die and then you're respawned at a preset location and you've lost some resource. This is the way that Dark Souls works, where you lose your souls and you have to go back and retrieve them. It's the way in Shovel Knight where you have to go and pick up your bags of jewels and stuff. And it's also the way that Hollow Knight works. But I think that looking at Hollow Knight in comparison to some of those other games sort of demonstrates why sometimes the same form of death doesn't accomplish the same, or might actually not be the right way, even if it's really great in other games. So in Shovel Knight, having your gems be tied to your death creates a risk associated with death, because you do want gems so you can go and do things and have gems to spend, obviously. But levels being pretty linear are going to lead you to the same spot that you were in when you lost your gems. So long as you don't make a mistake in a part of the level you'd already progressed through, you can get those gems, and the stakes, you're just playing through the game anyway, and play well and you'll get your gems back. However, in games like Hollow Knight, I think this is actually, I said before, Hollow Knight is one of my very favorite games of all time. But I think that the way it handles death is actually one of its weakest points, because Hollow Knight, being a game that's focused around exploration, I think is de-incentivizing or disincentivizing trying something else when you've lost and died. So when you go to a boss and you're just not ready for it and you die, the fact that you have to go back and reclaim your shade and your geo, which typically means going back and trying to accomplish the same thing that got you killed before. If you're not ready for that, then you're either forced to abandon the shade and geo, or you just beat your head against the wall until you get it done. However, with most of Hollow Knight, you play the game, and when you come across something you can't handle, you go and do something else, because there are enough other things to do, and there's enough of an emphasis on exploration and a reward for exploration that hardship isn't a brick wall for you to beat your head through. So I think they're encouraging the wrong thing with their death mechanic. Sorry about the tangent. Next question.
I wanted to ask your thoughts on Celeste. It's been one of my favorite games recently. I feel like that's a game that looks like it should be like crazy stressful, but it's actually like therapeutic, and I think possibly a reason for that is the low cost of death. I want to get your thoughts on that.
So I would like to start by saying that I do not find Celeste therapeutic in the slightest. It is the only game I have ever played that made me throw a controller.
Whoops.
That game made me mad as hell. But I absolutely understand why someone would find that to be their experience. You can find similar things in games like Cuphead. Some people find that game to be really, really stressful. Other people don't, because it doesn't do what Dark Souls does and throw up a banner that says you died and leaves it there for 7 centuries before you can finally respawn. It kills you and then it puts you back and gives you another shot. And I think that Celeste's way of handling death is exactly what Celeste as a game needed. I will say that when you get to the DLC, oh boy, things are stressful because it's demanding more perfection of you for a longer period of time. And so the risk as you get further and further becomes higher and higher. The stakes grow as you progress. And you could say something similar about Hollow Knight's Path of Pain. And yes, I did Hollow Knight's Path of Pain because I love Hollow Knight and hate myself. Any other questions about death? All right. So I'm going to take that as a no, and we're going to move on to kind of the opposite of death, saving. So I've talked about the role of risks and how risks affect how players behave. But let's think about how risk works with saving. Games with generous autosaves or whether games require specific save points. And if a player saves and loads, where they put back where they were when they saved? Are they put back at a nearby point that's predetermined? How frequently are they allowed to save? Are there multiple save slots? All those different options inform how players are going to engage with the game world. The more limitations there are on saves, the more precious they are and the more permanent the state of the game world feels, meaning that the threat of consequences feels less empty. The fewer limitations there are, the more flippantly the player is likely to use them and the more they disincentivize cautious behavior. How many times have you seen the meme about quick saving for Skyrim before slaughtering a town? Being able to save and reload with no consequence facilitates that kind of play. Generous autosaves tend to facilitate risky behavior as well as just flippant, not what you would want to do kinds of behavior. But they also allow the player to pay less attention to the actual act of saving. In a game where player skill and achievement are less important than exploration and where danger takes a back seat, autosaves can facilitate low-stress gameplay. However, remember this image? Choosing specific times to tell the player that the game is autosaving, say after entering a room for the first time, which would mean that you have comparably less information about what is actually in the room and are kind of grasping at straws for any information that you might use to base a prediction. It means that you can create a sense that there's a reason for the game to save. That sense that a player has is a prediction, but the game can use the autosave here to actually heighten stress by withholding the information necessary for making a full prediction, so long as the player's in a potentially threatening environment. Designated save points like the typewriters in Resident Evil, for example, tend to create a sense of anticipation in players as they spend more and more time without discovering one. In a suspenseful or stressful game, the discovery of a save point provides a player with a huge sense of relief and readies them to take their next step into the unknown. It's also worth noting that they provide exit points, which are a good thing for games to have. Exit points for players are good. Being able to save your game, quit, and load back to exactly the same spot with everything exactly as it was serves a similar function to generous autosaves. However, in the case of manual saves, there's a greater sense that a player can decide consciously that they want to perform an action that they know they are likely to regret or that they will otherwise want to take back. See, slaughtering an entire town in an RPG. If that aligns with your vision for what you'd like the player to be able to do, go for it. Otherwise, consider placing some restrictions on saving in order to preserve the weight of actions' consequences. Limitations on saving are important if you want to maintain a sense of permanence in player action and a threat of consequence as a result. Actions can really only have weight if they can't be easily undone. And so things like being unable to save while in enemy territory, or limiting saving to save points, or I think it was in the game Lisa, where there was a game mode where saves are limited to once per save point. Those kinds of options are choices made in the interest of creating a sense that the player doesn't own the world, but is part of it. And it contributes to the way that the player connects to the characters they control and the world at large. If the player's been forced to endure hardship as a result of a poor decision that they made along with their character, a kind of connection is developed. But if they were able to load their save every time something went wrong, then there weren't any stakes, and as a result, a connection is unlikely to develop. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about saving?
Are you familiar with Breath of the Wild saving system?
Yes.
Okay, so when I played that game, I lost a good bit of initiative to play it because I feel like the save system was never incentivizing me to play, I guess, the way I thought I should or wanted to play. And I just kind of wanted your interpretation of the way what they intended with it and how it ended up, like what effect it had on players with the way it was.
I think that their autosave system was a very good decision. I feel that their manual save was meant to provide more exit points for players so that it was more accessible to a larger audience. I think what they were doing was providing an autosave system that allowed players to play in a way that was more creative and perhaps more interesting without making a player feel like they were going to lose everything if they died. And Breath of the Wild at times is certainly one of the more difficult Zelda games. It's very, very easy to die, especially early game. And so I think by providing frequent autosaves, especially outside of enemy camps and things like that, and by providing manual saves that are pretty just, if I remember correctly, the manual saves put you back where you were when you made the save. And I think that that's absolutely what they should have done for the game that they were making. Can I ask what kind of play that you wanted to play or felt that you should, but felt disincentivized from doing so?
I'm a guy who kind of likes, I think I've grown to not be bothered by death in a lot of games. I think going at something hard, getting punished for dying and going at it again is kind of the fun of games sometimes. And I found myself, early game, there were some fights I shouldn't have won that, I thought it was a bunch of fun to save before and keep trying till I could. But then there was also times where I wanted to try something, I saved at some point, and then it was a bit inconsistent. I felt like when it would autosave, or at least I couldn't figure out when it was autosaving, and it would autosave over things, and there's times I found myself abusing the save system more than I personally would have wanted to since it was there. And I don't know. I guess I dislike the fact personally that I had so much control over the save states, is I guess what it was.
I think that there's a point where you have to allow the player to be responsible for how they use the save system and whether that's how they want to play the game or not. But like I said, I think that the reason that it was implemented the way that it was because they have to consider such a large audience, whereas games with smaller, more specific audiences can choose to make more perhaps divisive decisions or bolder decisions in a lot of cases.
Excellent. Thank you.
What about in cases like in the modern Mario games where like my first experience with a 2D Mario game was New Super Mario Bros. On the DS, and
Okay.
in that game you play through the worlds and like you can only save at the castles, and so you have to play the game until you reach a castle and you can like stop playing the game. But then in the next game, New Super Mario Bros. For the Wii, New Super Mario Bros. 2, they kept that, but they also added quick saves, which were just a little balloon. But otherwise, you could quick save as much as you want. But they still kept the saving at castles. And even in the modern, like even the newer 3D Mario games, they still have that. You can save at the castles, like auto save, but you can quick save whenever you want as well. So I'm like, I said they kind of have a save identity crisis because they're keeping the old one, but then like the quick save's basically the only way to save.
Yeah, I haven't played the new DS ones, but I have played the ones for Wii, and I will say that I was initially struck by the way that they did saving. I never actually picked up on the castles having a different means of saving, or I think after you beat a castle, it asks you if you want to save, and sure, obviously you've made progress. There's no reason to not save. Quick saving exits you to the menu, and it keeps you where you were in the game. I don't really know that those games are meant to be played by kids and people who just want to have a fun, jolly old time. So I don't think that the stakes of death or of losing progress are meant to be the emphasis. Okay, so last thought. Remember that mechanics are like cooks in a kitchen. The number of things that you as a designer choose to require your player to keep track of in their minds and manage is really important. Not every game needs to have skill trees, a hunger mechanic, a stamina meter, even a health bar. In general, it's a good idea to take out superfluous mechanics that don't directly contribute something important to the player's experience of the game or its world. Overfilling your game with mechanics is likely to have a number of consequences. It's likely to overwhelm your player and distract them from the heart of your game. It's likely to muddy the waters as to what's really important. You could think of it as too much information, making it difficult for a player or for anyone to tell where their attention is supposed to be directed. It's also certain to complicate the process of balancing all of your game's mechanics. And it's certain to demand that you spend more of your time designing and developing extra gameplay elements to support those mechanics instead of spending the time polishing and executing well on your core game. And sometimes designers want to put mechanics in because they want to create a sense in the player that they need to keep tabs on X, Y, and Z thing or they'll face consequences. And what they're doing is they're trying to create a sense of engaging eustress. So that good anxiety that propels you to take action, motivating stress. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll usually find that it's not the number of things that's creating that sense, but rather the threat of consequence itself. The same goal it can often be achieved by using a single relevant mechanic and upping the threat of consequence rather than spreading the player thin with a lot of smaller problems. It also tends to make the fulfillment or maintenance of that mechanic feel a lot better for a player because you get that one solid dopamine rush rather than just beating yourself over the head with a bunch of smaller ones. And sometimes designers worry that if they don't include extra mechanics, that a player is going to be pulled out of the experience, that immersion is at risk. And not that immersion needs to be the goal or that it should be the goal necessarily. Please don't think that it should. But regardless, they think that immersion is at risk if they don't include all these extra mechanics, but that's bullshit. I say this as someone who very, very much fell into that trap for a long time, and it caused a lot of people to spend time doing stuff that they could have better spent their time doing other things. The absence of information that doesn't affect them is usually pretty unlikely to pull a player out of an experience. Far more frequently, the opposite happens. Immersion doesn't come from a game world that follows all the rules of the real world. It comes from a game world that establishes clear rules for itself and follows them. Immersion comes from consistency, but that's not to say sameness. Newness and surprise, so long as they're not the result of a contradiction in the game world's rules, are exciting and necessary for engagement. But adding mechanics is usually not the best way to increase immersion, and it's almost never the best way to remedy existing problems with immersion. Does anyone have any other questions? Maybe why I called this designing mechanics as information?
Why did you call it designing mechanics as information?
I'll tell you, Megan. Because at its heart, so when I'm talking about saving, I'm talking about the choices that a player makes given different systems for saving. And what they're choosing to do is based off of the information that they have about the game itself. Information like whether their actions have permanence, whether the stakes are, how high the stakes are. And those things are informed by things like save mechanics. Saving as a mechanic is a form of information because it clues the player in to how important their actions are, how reversible their actions are. When it comes to death mechanics are a form of information that clues a player in to how carefully they need to behave. How slowly do they need to turn this corner, because they don't necessarily know how dangerous what might be on the other side is. The key of information, or the key to information, is that everything that a player does in a game is based on what information that they've been given to base their decisions off of. A hole in the ground is information. Do you jump in the hole or do you not? You need other information to determine whether that's a good idea. Mechanics are a really potent means of offering critical information to players. Upgrades, in-game currency and resources, enemy placement, difficulty, they all influence player behavior by offering the player information that leads them to predict their chances of being able to do certain things. And like I said before, player perception leads to affect. That's affect with an A. That's feeling. And as a result, they lead to action. And player perception is determined by what, how much, and by what means information has been made available to them.
I'd also like to throw out, if anyone has any questions, just regarding like game dev in general, because Jackson, you've got a lot of experience working on stuff in group work and in working with the job you have right now. So
yeah,
you're a pretty good source of information.
I've done stuff.
Here's a question. So people have probably got the game jam on their mind coming up in a couple days.
Sure.
If you could give some advice on like the mental state people should be in when they're looking to design their games for this game jam.
Sure. So step number one is to, within the first day, having either a minimum viable product, meaning you have a mechanic and that's it. If we're talking about the original Super Mario Brothers, a minimum viable product is moving left and right and jumping. Maybe a pit. That's a minimum viable product. If you've made that engaging, then you move on and you polish that up. Because that's pretty much all you're going to, if you have as much time as an adult with other stuff going on in their lives, and all of you have stuff going on in your lives, then a game jam scope is going to be small. But if we're just talking about brainstorming and stuff, don't look for a perfect idea. Look for a decent idea and run with it. Take a decent idea, a good enough idea, and iterate. Iterating is the best thing you can do as a designer. And don't be too attached to your ideas. And because if you're attached to your ideas, when you find yourself running out of time, you're going to be crushed.
A quick question though, like in terms of scope, how big, or I guess small in this case, should a game jam game be, in your opinion?
There is no should. It depends entirely on your experience.
That's true.
I mean, the first game jam that I went to, I didn't do any programming, so it's maybe not the best example, but what I can do in just by myself in a few hours now is far more than I could have accomplished over the course of an entire game jam or entire semester when I first started out. So it depends entirely on who you're working with, what your skills are, and what kind of how ambitious your ideas are. And I will say, keep your ambitions small. You can always work on a project after the game jam, but just having something to show at the end it's fun. It's what it's for.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you've said something about or you've said a lot of stuff about scope before, Jackson, but like in particular, I feel like you had a saying like take what you think you can do and cut it in half or more.
No, it's a lot less than that. Take what you think you can do in a week if you were given if you could work a full-time job for a week. Now that is what you should expect to do in a semester. If you were to work in addition to doing school, that's what you should expect to be able to accomplish. Actually, depending on how new you are, let's say if you had a whole weekend to do nothing but work on a game, take that. Pretend you didn't need to sleep. Take that, and you do need to sleep. Get sleep. Do it. You'll be better for it. Take that amount of time and treat that as your semester. And then you'll be like, oh wow, I've accomplished my goal. And it's a week before the semester ends. But yeah, the point is, even the folks who have been doing this for a long time, we overestimate how quickly we can get things done. You will, even if you go into something thinking you know exactly how to handle or accomplish your goal, there will be something that comes up. Without fail, it will happen. Scope down.
Jackson, outside of game jams, what would you say is the most important design lesson that you learned from this club?
First of all, listen to everyone who's saying stuff, because if you're new, and all of us are new, myself included, I'm still a novice. I haven't been at this. I don't have my 10,000 hours in. I'm a novice. Listen to everyone who has input. That's important. But more than that, make something simple and test it. Iterate. Make something, fail, do it again. Fail faster. Fail faster. Don't spend your time trying to develop the perfect mechanic that will be perfect on its first go. Make something, just block it out and test it. If it works, move forward with it. If it doesn't, scrap it. You shouldn't have spent enough time on it for scrapping it to be a painful endeavor. Being able to say when you're wrong and not putting so much pride in a single idea and not being defensive of your baby, it helps.
On that topic, something that my one of my art teachers said is "kill your darlings." I like that term.
I also like that term. Kill your darlings. Oh, and working with other people. If you're relying on other people to do things, you can't complain when things aren't done if you're not paying them to do it. That's just a general rule. If you're not paying someone to do it, there's only so much complaining you're allowed to do when it doesn't get done. Because other people have lives. Oh, and other thing that learned from club, as a designer, learn as much as you can about what goes into each discipline's work, because your job as a designer involves a lot of talking and communicating and articulating your ideas to people in different disciplines who have a lot more trouble communicating with one another than you could possibly imagine, or just who don't do it at all. And this isn't specifically at club, it's just at teams. Teams are awful at talking to one another unless you have people who are there to talk between teams. And so learning what goes into each discipline's work will make knowing what you're asking of them and knowing how to talk to them about things and giving feedback much, much better. It will make the whole thing easier. It will make everyone involved much happier. And it will also, you'll gain a much higher respect for everyone doing their work, because there is no part of game dev that is easy. It's hard, all of it.
All right. If there's no more questions, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Jackson. This was awesome.